Jambo, welcome to the Guyana Reparations Commission 1823 Bicentennial exhibition. What we've done is to break the exhibition into 5 sections. We wanted it to be holistic. So we began by speaking about Africa before enslavement, because most people have a different view of Africa and we would like to reintroduce them to Africa. Then we'll go to the Middle Passage, where Africans were captured and transported to the West Indies, including Guyana. We will then speak about plantation life and the resistance to slavery. We'll then continue into the 1823 rebellion, which is the central theme of this exhibition. And of course, you know, in 1823, 11,000 enslaved Africans revolted, and they came from 55 plantations, but we'll get to that. Most people don't realize that Africans have been on this earth for 3.2 million years. This skeleton, Lucy, was found in Ethiopia in 1975 and was carbon dated to be 3.2 million years. The same technology used to put people on the moon, the same technology was used to carbon date it. So Africans have been on this earth for 3.2 million years. The first people on earth, the cradle of civilization, is Africa. And of course, Lucy was 6 feet, 64 pounds and 4 feet 2 inches. Now, chronologically, let's move to a different era. These are the Lubumbo bones. This was found in Swaziland and near South Africa border. It's 35,000 years old. And this is the oldest mathematical artifact. Indeed, African women were the first mathematicians. They were using this bone to calculate their menstrual cycle. And of course, it's the modern day artifact that led to mathematics. Over here, we talk about the journey of man. Every person on earth has an African descendant. And as you could see, there are 7 migrations out of Africa where people went to Europe, Asia, China, Australia. And so if you want to talk about a modern Adam, the modern Adam is an African who was born close to Ethiopia. As we move forward in time, this is the Sphinx. This is the Pyramid of Corfu, which is about 5,000 years old. It was made of 1.3 million stones, each stone about 2.5 tons to 15 tons. Today, people with all the modern technologies cannot rebuild this pyramid. It is one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Now here is Imhotep, the father of medicine, the father of many things. The reason he's next to the pyramid is that he built the first step pyramid at Saqqara. Now, most people don't know that he is the father of medicine. He actually operated in 82 different diseases and surgeries, and was worshipped as a king as well as a priest for over 1,000 years. Now, he was black, Imhotep. Next to Imhotep is King Tut, the boy king. Of course, he is well known for what was found in his tomb. His mask was made out of 25 pounds of solid gold. And his father was King Akhenaten, who was essentially the father of monotheism. But his god was the sun, S-U-N. His mother was Queen Nefertiti. So here's a different version of King Tut. He was created using artificial intelligence software. And as you could see, we have him in his golden splendor. And next to him is his mother, Queen Nefertiti, who's considered the most beautiful woman ever. Her mother, or her ancestry, was Queen Tai, who is considered one of the greatest queens of Africa. So we started here trying to introduce you to Africa before enslavement. People only know Africa in terms of the slave trade, in terms of current day violence, but Africa has a tremendous history that started 3.2 million years ago. And most people don't know that Africa is not only the cradle of civilization, but a cradle of mathematics And Pythagoras, who said that he found pi, pi was in the pyramids 2,000 years before Pythagoras was born. As we continue with Africa before enslavement, here is Mansa Musa, the richest man ever to have lived. And he is placed across from Timbuktu, because Timbuktu is in Mali, and Timbuktu was in his era. Now in Guyana, people try to laugh at you and say you are from Timbuktu. But you should be proud, because Timbuktu exists, and Timbuktu has 700,000 manuscripts, astronomy, geography, you name it, science, chemistry, physics. So King Tut, Mansa Musa, Timbuktu, the libraries of Timbuktu, and to make this gender balanced, we have here in Africa before enslavement, we have some incredible queens. We have Queen Amina, who fought the slave trade, and then we have Queen Nzinga. Now, Queen Nzinga in Angola lived until she was 82 years of age. She had to kill her brother, who used to sell Africans into slavery. She took over from him and fought the Portuguese for quite a while. At age 82, she would still dress as a man and go into the fields and fight the slave trade. Of course, over here, we've heard about the famous Benin bronzes. It just shows you the type of technology that existed in Africa a long time before enslavement. Right now, the Kingdom of Benin, which used to be Nigeria, they're now fighting to get these bronze images back. Another thing not well known is that Africa had a lot of writing systems. Here we have two of them. Of course, you know about the hieroglyphs, but Africa is the first continent to have had writing. Most people don't realize that Africa is comprised of 3,000 tribes and they speak 2,000 languages. This is something that's lost in our history books. As we go here to finalize the section on Africa before enslavement, there were great civilizations in Africa, great kingdoms. Today, there are over 767 kingdoms still existing in Africa. But you could see the royal families, you could see their children over there. Africa, the cradle of civilization, had the first real kingdoms. And those kingdoms were very wealthy, only to be interrupted in their trajectory to be a great economic power by enslavement. Let's move on to the second element of the 1823 exhibition. Behind me, you see several pictures. At my immediate right are the architects of slavery, of chattel slavery. Most people don't know that it was the Catholic Church in 1452 that began this process. During those times, the Catholic Church issued papal bulls. The papal bulls were first issued by the Catholic Church. King Alonso received it from Pope Nicholas V. Here is a copy of it, and they're online. Essentially, these are ecclesiastical laws that made things happen during that period of time. And so the Catholic Church is the architect of slavery. This is a picture of the door of no return. This is where our ancestors came through. It was the last time they saw Africa. Of course, now in Ghana, there's a door of return. And this is Goree Island. This is where this particular door of no return was. And it gives you an idea that there were many forts and castles built in Africa by Europeans. As a matter of fact, Ghana alone has 40 castles. And these castles were where they held enslaved Africans who they probably would have marched for a day from the interior of Africa. What is most sad about this, and it comes back to the Catholic Church and Christianity, is that each one of these forts, each one of these dungeons, above it was a church. Let's move over now to the horrors of the Middle Passage. The journey from Africa lasted 3 to 6 months. And as you could see from these pictures, it was very crowded. People hardly had anywhere to breathe. All their feces was among them. There were children, there were women, and on these shave slips, the brutality was mind-boggling. As a matter of fact, sharks followed these ships because sometimes Africans would jump overboard, but more often or not, if they were running out of food, they would throw Africans overboard, as you can see in this particular picture. They'd be whipped on board, and here you see where the sailors are selecting which African women to rape. That was something very constant on the Middle Passage. 3 to 6 months, brutal, the actual beginning of the crime against humanity as was slavery described. Now, as we continue here, you could see that it was very cruel. Just before they landed, they would wash them down and brush them down because they would then have to sell them at slave markets. And here are the weapons of torture. You could see that the torture was very creative and came in many different forms. So the Middle Passage was the process of bringing enslaved Africans or captured Africans to Guyana, to the Caribbean, to North America, and 15% of those who were on the ships died. And so when people say that there were 12.5 million people who arrived who were enslaved, they're not telling the truth, because about 15% died in the Middle Passage, about 12% died when they were marching them from the villages to the ships on the ocean. And when they came to Guyana, within 3 years, 33% of them died. So if you were to attack a village with 200 enslaved, by the time they got to Guyana and were sold, only 35 survived. So this is the end of section 2, which is the Middle Passage. This section is really about plantation life when they arrived in Guyana or Jamaica or Barbados. Life was barbaric. They worked for long hours without pay. They were whipped. By the way, they were branded, men, women, and child, so that you would know who owned them. And so, as Africans are survivalists, you will see that they got involved in all sorts of things to help to keep their culture alive. The dancing and drumming were prohibited, but during holidays they would actually have them dance. Africans, of course, grew their own food on the limited plots they had because the food from the slave owners was very limited. But again, you see the tools of torture, you see the brutality, and you see that life was not a picnic. And as you come around here, you would see the crops they grew, you would see the religions they adopted. They were forced ultimately to become Christians. The first Muslims in Guyana came from Africa. They came before indentured servants some were also Muslims. There's a famous word in Guyana. When you see a Muslim priest, you call him a Fulaman. That is from the Fulani tribe. The Fulani tribe, of course, are Muslims, and the women consider themselves the most beautiful women in the world. These are some of the many tools that were used to shackle them. Here is a map on the wall that shows the many plantations that existed in Guyana. Over 300 to 500, depending on the period. And ultimately, our ancestors bought these plantations and turned them into villages. Here's coffee. We know of the 1763 rebellion. It occurred before the Haitian Revolution. This is because they were tired of the brutality, tired of the starvation, tired of the treatment they got. And this rebellion is often forgotten. As I said, it occurred before the Haitian Revolution, and this went on for more than a year. Indeed, Kofi declared himself governor and told the Dutch governor, Guggenheim, that he should rule half of the Berbice and Kofi would rule a half. Of course, there are many reasons why the slave rebellion occurred: harsh treatment, brutality. But the rebellion failed because of many reasons. One being that there was a disagreement in terms of strategy. There were many different tribes involved. Akara, Kofi, all of those were involved in this intriguing one-year event. But it made the Dutch realize that the slaves or the enslaved, we shouldn't call them slaves, they were enslaved, were unhappy with their condition and revolted. So we went through the first section, Africa before enslavement. We went through the Middle Passage. We just went through plantation life and the fact that there was resistance because enslaved Africans were never happy with slavery. So that is the end of this particular segment. We'll now go and look into the 1823 rebellion, which is the heart and soul of this exhibition. The 1823 Demerara slave rebellion, so written in history books. We look at it differently in the Guyana Reparations Committee. We call it the 1823 Demerara Freedom Revolt. Essentially what happened is that in 1807, a Dutchman, Hermanus Post, wrote to the London Missionary Society asking for missionaries to be brought to Guyana to teach the enslaved. He was Dutch and he owned plantations in Guyana. Most people don't realize that the Dutch were still here and they were here until 1834. So the London Missionary Society sent John Ray first, and he taught for 14 years in Georgetown. He was then sent to Berbice, and replacing him was John Smith, who is this gentleman here. Now, in 1823, depending on which book you read, 10,000 to 12,000 enslaved Africans rose up for their freedom. They were being punished for not being allowed to go to church on Sunday. Now, the London Missionary Society taught them to read and write. And as you could see on the wall, we have several letters, including an original letter from Kwamina, who was one of the key individuals in the 1823. These three individuals are our version of Kwamina, Amber, and Jack. Kwamina Gladstone, Jack Gladstone, and Amber. They were central figures in the fight. Now, Kwamina was a deacon, and he was a deacon at the church that was built by Hermanus Post at Success, and that church was built to hold 600. Now, he was very well respected. When John Ray was moved to Berbice, he taught the enslaved using the Bible. And of course, when the Demerara Freedom Revolt started, the key person was Jack. Now, Jack had been kicked out of church for many reasons, but they were tired of being enslaved, they were tired of being starved, they were tired of not getting their rights. There was a rumor that someone in England had freed them. That wasn't true. But fundamentally, the rebellion was about getting back their Sundays, which they used to go to church. They were being restricted. Sugar was now being planted. Sugar demanded more labor, and more labor meant that the enslaved had to work harder. These were generated by artificial intelligence software by a Guyanese by the name of Mandisa Baptist, who lives in Norway. And she used her intuition and intelligence to manipulate the software to create images of our ancestors who led the revolution. As a matter of fact, what is fascinating is that the Gladstones were here recently, and during that trip, we were able to find descendants of the Gladstones. And when we put Oswald Glasgow's face next to Kwamina's, it was identical almost. It was quite revealing. So Miss Mandisa Baptist was able to capture the real flesh form. We in the Guyana Reparations Committee are unhappy with the caricatures we were seeing of Kwamina and Jack. It shows them as hollow, humanless, without any humanity, without any real life. They were real people. They were enslaved Africans, and this is our depiction. And we're hoping that these renditions of who they are now will now be used. Now here is a letter from Kwamina, and to show, look at his handwriting. They were taught to read and write. His handwriting is better than most of the doctors I know. And here's how human he was. He says, "Dear Master, hoping these few lines may find you and your family in good health. We bless God for his goodness in enabling da-da-da." So they were very caught up in their Christianity. This was a man, John Smith, who the British blamed for the resurrection, blamed for the Demerara uprising. But he had nothing to do with it other than teaching them to read and write and about teaching them the Bible. And all these documents here are from the archives. In London, in the University of London, at the School of Oriental and African Studies, there are 35,000 items about Guyana, and especially about the 1823 revolution that is there. Those documents include the tribes, the transcripts of the trials. It includes all of the manuscripts that were being developed during that time, diaries from John Smith, diaries from John Ray, detailed reports that were sent back by the missionaries to London on a monthly basis. And so we can capture a lot about what was going on the plantations. As a matter of fact, we have a picture there of Elizabeth. This is in 1819, just to show you how things were in Guyana. She was 10 years going on 11. One of the colonists raped her, and they blamed it on a young enslaved African. So the doctor conspired to say, no, it wasn't the colonist. She died from her rape, and she was 10 to 11, but it just shows you how the system was conspiring to say that it wasn't the colonists. But we know that from studies, 36% of all enslaved African women were raped. That's a figure that has been acquired. Now, here is John Gladstone. He owned Plantation Success. His ancestors were here a few weeks ago, 6 of them. They apologized. What is interesting about John Gladstone is that he also owned the 2 ships that brought enslaved Africans here as well as indentured. The first 2 ships that brought East Indians to Guyana, 396 of them, they came on his ships. 414 left India, 18 died on the journey, but this is Gladstone, the Gladstone experiment. On this wall here, we also have the abolitionists. There was a vast movement going on in England at the time, petitions. These are people who were very Christian, who objected to one man owning another. And on the wall here, you have Clarkson, you have Wilberforce, and you have Hannah More, 3 of the many abolitionists. What is tragic is that Wilberforce, who fought for emancipation, he died in 1833, the same year that the Emancipation Act was passed. Here's a chart that showed the route of the rebellion. It started in Mahaica and ended up all the way on parade ground. And here battle scenes that were generated again by artificial intelligence software, again by Miss Mandisa Baptiste, and you could see how real these were. This was a bachelor's adventure where over 200 were shot. And what is sad is that when they were killed, the colonists forced other Africans to cut the heads off of other Africans, and they then put them on stakes and had them on poles, on staves, from Mahaica to parade ground. So you could see what occurred during that time. Now, after the battle and after they were tried, The major event was John Smith's trial. And John Smith's trial was a thing that the whole Caribbean looked at. In the archives in London, there are newspapers following the trial. Indeed, I saw in the archives in London the Guyana Chronicle from 1806. And the trials were of interest to the whole Caribbean because this was the largest rebellion in the Caribbean at the time. 10 to 12,000 enslaved Africans from 55 plantations. There you have a picture of parade ground where there were trials, there were summary executions, and Paris and Telemachus and others were hung. So beyond that, 1823 was significant in that it accelerated the Emancipation Act. This uprising, which was driven by Christians, together with the 1831 Baptist War in Jamaica, forced the British, along with the abolitionists, to look at slavery differently, and the Emancipation Act was passed. Now, in Guyana, of course, we went beyond the Emancipation Act to the greatest entrepreneurial activity of any enslaved society. And this is known as the village movement. In Guyana, of course, our ancestors cleared 15,000 square miles. It's remarkable, and people don't realize it, in that 15,000 square miles was almost twice the rest of all the islands combined. If you do Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent, Grenada, wherever else there was slavery in the British colonies, when you add up all of those countries, it came up to less than 8,000 square miles. But our ancestors cleared 15,000 square miles, or 18% of Guyana, and we lost 473,000 Africans in building Guyana. Most people don't understand that. But whilst they were doing that, as you will see, they cleared not only 15,000 square miles, they cleared 9 million acres of land. And they moved 100 million tons of earth with their bare hands. As a matter of fact, all of Guyana, all the infrastructure for the sugar estates, the dams, the drains, all were built by enslaved Africans during that 200 years of enslavement. So the village movement, Guyana's greatest entrepreneurial activity, started with Victoria, where on the 7th of November 1839, 83 freed Africans, including 5 women, pooled their money together, hid it in the ground under a tree, dug it up, put it in a wheelbarrow, and walked 29 kilometers to Georgetown to buy it. Now, how did they get this money? Well, after emancipation, there was a period of apprenticeship where freed or semi-freed Africans were only paid overtime. So they collected those meager amounts, pooled it together, buried it, and ultimately ended up buying over 300 plantations, which they turned into villages. Now, nowhere else in the British colonies was there such an exercise. And as you could read from the village movement, it was a real estate activity, it was nation building, community building, it was about food security, it was about freedom, they had their own laws, and this is the basis of Guyana, villages. So our ancestors, through their purchasing of plantations, turning them into villages, created modern Guyana. So they're the fathers of Guyana. As a matter of fact, there were 4 principles in the village movement: family, school, church, and self-reliance. And if you were to go across Guyana, you'll find a Congregational church, which has its history from the London Missionary Society, that they were in each village, and they underpin our religious activity in our villages. So the Congregational church is important in Guyana's history. Just a few weeks ago, we had a bicentennial ceremony at Bethel Congregational, which is in BV. It wasn't success, but it was broken down into 2. 2/3 went to BV, 1/3 went to Plaisance. And so in Plaisance, you'll find a Zorg Congregational church, which is 1/3 of the original. So let's talk a little bit more about the village movement. As you could see, here are the reasons why. The land was available. The attitudes for freed Africans, they didn't want to go back on the plantation. The planters wanted to sell off. And so as you look at this wall, you'll see the history of Victoria, you'll see the transports, you'll see BV, and you'll see all the things that were done by our ancestors on the village movement. So moving beyond the crisis and the criminality of the 1823, our ancestors rebounded. But that's not surprising. At the end of emancipation, a freed African in Guyana was worth 51 pounds, whereas a freed African in the rest of the Caribbean was worth 17 pounds. And that shows our ancestors' entrepreneurship, because they moved from enslavement into buying villages in the greatest entrepreneurial activity in any post-slavery society. So that's another segment of this exhibition. We started with Africa before enslavement. We spoke about the Middle Passage. We spoke about plantation life. We spoke about resistance to slavery. We talked about 1763. Of course, we showed you the 1823 rebellion, Jack Amber Kwamina, John Smith, Jack Gladstone. We showed you the abolitionists, the battle scenes, hanging, and the brutality of summary judgments and being killed. And then, of course, the rebunks, which is the village movement. So we now want to talk about the final element of that, which is reparations. Slavery was and is a crime against humanity. That was agreed upon in Durban in 2011. And of course, with a crime against humanity, there should be reparatory justice. What CARICOM did was in 2013 of June 2013, all the heads of states unanimously agreed to pursue reparations from 8 European countries. They set up a structure which at the top had a Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations, which has 5 prime ministers. Beneath is a CARICOM Reparations Commission, which is chaired by Sir Hilary Beckles, and that commission has the heads of national committees, of which I'm a member. I'm the chair of the Guyana Reparations Committee. I'm also vice chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. So we have the task of mobilizing support for reparations, of educating the public about reparations, of addressing European issues when it comes to them resisting reparations, and of course, of doing evaluation. So in Guyana, we've written the Guyana reparations story. We've also done evaluation of what Britain owes us, what Holland owes us, and most recently in the Brattle Report, the Brattle Report was put together under the auspices of Patrick Robinson, who is a Jamaican on the IC, International Court of Justice. Holland owes Guyana about $42 billion. Britain owes Guyana over $1 trillion. So we're pursuing that. But CARICOM has a 10-point plan. You can see the first point is apology. We had the Gladstones apologizing. It touches repatriation. It touches indigenous development program, health, education, technology. It talks about cultural, well, they have to give us back our cultural items. It talks about debt relief, etc. And so that's what we're pursuing, a developmental strategy. And so we have the CARICOM 10-point plan. We have meetings every week in the Guyana Reparations Committee. We're the only committee that meets weekly. We're open to the public. We are the Museum of African Heritage. And this work you see here is work put together by the Guyana Reparations Committee. You could see we have members here. They're the ones that take people around to discuss it. So this is our story as shown through the exhibition. We gave you a taste of Africa before enslavement, magnificent civilizations, technology, the pyramids, people like Imhotep, Mansa Musa, King Tut, Queen Nzinga, Queen Amina, lots of things that happened. We showed you that Africans were the first people on earth and the civilizations that came. We showed you the Lubumba bones, which showed that African women were the first to use mathematics. We took you through the Middle Passage, the horrors of the Middle Passage. We showed you what happened. They would throw us overboard, they would starve us. And when they arrived in the Caribbean, of course, they were sold and branded. We then showed you the Plantation Life, how horrible it was. We showed you Coffee and his resistance to slavery. That's the 1763 rebellion, which lasted over a year. We then came upstairs and we showed you the 1823 rebellion, which is the largest rebellion ever in the Caribbean. 55 plantations, 10 to 12,000 enslaved. And of course, here's the story of what happened. Of course, beyond that, we talked about emancipation, we talked about the village movement, and finally we ended with the CARICOM Reparations Commission and the expectations of the Guyana Reparations Committee. We expect reparations in this decade. Lots of things are happening. The Dutch Prime Minister apologized. The Dutch King apologized. The Portuguese Prime Minister is thinking of apologizing. The Church of England apologized. Glasgow University, Cambridge, Harvard, Bank of England, Bank of Holland. All of these groups are apologizing. And now it's for us to use our initiative to make sure that we have a win-win situation. And what do I mean by that? The Brattle report says that 31 countries owe $107 trillion. Anybody who expects the Europeans will throw over $107 trillion are working from a win-lose framework. We need a win-win framework. We need the Europeans to give us 1% of their GDP for 400 years. That is more win-win. They can afford it, and we can absorb it. So the Guyana Reparations Committee believes that in any negotiation for reparations, we have to be sensible and we have to do win-win. But we know that reparations will come in this decade. Thank you.